reading books to learn how to do it. Nobody does that anymore. I became a writer. I've been writing fishing articles for many magazines, everything from Bassmaster to, used to be on the staff at Fishing and Honey News and wrote the Bass column in Fishing and Honey News for many years. I still write all the time for magazines like westernbass.com, and Chris is going to print a list of articles that you would find interesting, I'm sure, to help you learn how to do some of these different techniques by watching or reading the articles and watching the videos that are involved. In almost all my Western Bass magazine articles, I also include a video that demonstrates what I'm teaching in the article. But I also started a YouTube channel 2 years ago. The YouTube channel is simply my name. It's at Marc Marcantonio, and he's going to give you a list of YouTube videos that I've produced. In the last 2 years, I have over 100 videos on that list. And the videos vary from fishing local lakes, basically a little fishing show showing my catches on local lakes like American Lake. A lot of them are on American Lake. Just so you know, American Lake is like 5 miles from my house, and it's always been the toughest lake around for me to catch fish in, and so I have made it a science. I have made it my passion to learn how to catch fish on that lake, and it has been a long, hard road to figure it all out, and I'm still figuring it out every day, and that's what interests me about it, is I don't know everything there is to know about it. I know one thing: I'm catching a lot more and a lot bigger bass now than I was 2 years ago, and that's because I'm concentrating on it. So a lot of the things that I talk about in the articles and in my YouTube videos, I'm very open about fishing. You know, I'm not one of those guys that when you go to a tournament and you win and people say, oh, what'd you catch them on? I'm not the guy that stands up there and says, oh, I caught them on topwaters out at the dam. You know, if I don't want you to know, I just won't tell you. I'll just tell you I don't want to say, and I usually only do that for my partner's sake. But 9 times out of 10, I'm very open about what I did and what I caught them on, and I do that in my videos. You can see my videos, me catching the fish. I always show what lure I caught them on and how I caught them, because I don't want you to have to walk to the library to read about it in a book. I want you to, you know, bass fishing's been very good to me. So I'm interested in sharing that. And I say bass fishing. All the bass guys know me as a bass fisherman. All my trout friends know me as a trout fisherman. I used to be the president of the Tacoma chapter of Trout Unlimited and the Northwest Steelhead and Salmon Council. The salmon guys know me as a salmon fisherman. I fish saltwater. I fish with a fly rod. I fish every type of fishing there is. Fishing is my passion. Fishing is who I am. So despite the multiple careers and tournaments and everything else, if it's fishing, I'm interested in it. So I try to learn. And that's why I still stay up with technology. My boat, my bass boat, is equipped with the latest and greatest technology. There's no one else in this room that has some of the electronic equipment that I have on my boat. And I can tell you that for a fact, because one of the products I've been using for the last year is a Forward Facing Sonar aiming system called Revolution Sonar. That is, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll show you a video. I'll show you this video to show you some features of it. But most of you have heard of a turret where you mount your Forward Facing Sonar transducer on a turret, and you steer the turret, usually motor driven, some are manual. You steer it to aim your Forward Facing Sonar transducer wherever you want to look to see if there are fish swimming around. Well, I have stayed away from those turrets for many years because as a tournament fisherman, the hassles of dealing with a turret are insurmountable in my mind, especially if you fish big water like the Columbia River where you have huge waves and you're taking weights over the bow of your boat. They just don't stand up to the rigors of tournament fishing. But a guy that I know in Kentucky named Paul Bird developed this Revolution Sonar system, and I knew from the moment I heard about it talking to him that this was something that I was going to want to get involved in. And it's basically a motorized turret that mounts directly to your a trolling motor shaft. It mounts integral to the trolling motor shaft. So when you pull your trolling motor up, you're pulling the Revolution Sonar aiming system up. When you set it back down, you're already ready to go. It's got a foot pedal. This is the foot pedal. I took it off my boat. It's made out of billet aluminum. He machines everything himself. He has a CNC machine in his shop, and he designed everything himself. He wrote the software himself. This guy's an electrical, mechanical, and computer software engineering expert. And it's just amazing what he's done. I set this on my deck, and I can steer with my toe, my transducers on my trolling motor anywhere I want. I can set it to scan on its own. I can keep my motor, my electric motor, on anchor lock, which most turrets you can't do this with. I can anchor lock my boat and stay in one spot, and I can look all around the boat with my forward-facing sonar to spot fish or bait fish or structure. And I can set this so that it scans on its own. I can have it scan 360 degrees. I can have it scan real fast, or I can have it scan real slow as you can imagine. There's all kinds of things that you can do with this, and I'll show you a little video clip. Why don't I do that right now?
Mark, is that wireless?
It is not wireless. So it's a NEMA connection, and so I have a NEMA cable coming up by my foot pedal, and I just screw it into here. It's waterproof, waterproof connections. This whole thing is waterproof. It'll operate completely submerged underwater. If you go to his website, you'll see a video of him steering the trolling motor while it's underwater, while the foot pedal's underwater. Let's see if I can get this to play.
Okay, so let me show you a couple things. You can see I color code my map, and this is using the Lowrance CMAP social map, and you can color the contours. So if I'm catching fish in this light green range, then I can just easily follow those contours and know exactly where I should be fishing. Let me show you how I go to a waypoint with the autopilot. I press a waypoint, and when the name comes up, touch the name, then go down here to go to, hit go to, and then you'll get another, it'll ask if you want engaged autopilot and nav mode. Hit yes, and then you either can turn up your speed just a little bit. I'm going to clear the cursor, and now you see it's taking my boat directly to that waypoint, and when it gets there, I have it programmed to anchor when it gets there. Okay, it's arriving, and so now it is anchoring the boat. You can see my ghost motor arrow is turning around. So that's how I use the autopilot to navigate to a waypoint. Now let me show you a little bit on the Revolution Sonar, which is my forward-facing sonar aiming system. Here's the foot pedal, and I've got the foot pedal. I don't have it screwed down to my deck yet because I'm not exactly sure which position I want it, whether I want it up here, back here, over here. Right now I'm leaving it over here, which seems to be a good position. And you can steer, you see the green lights, those 3 green LEDs show that I'm in manual mode. So whenever I turn this disc, you can see it's aiming my transducers wherever those 3 green dots are looking. And on the screen, when I rotate it, you'll see the bottom move, and that's because I'm turning the disc on the foot pedal on the Revolution Sonar with my toes, and that way I can look around wherever I want in manual mode. Now, if I press the left button one time over here, now it's switched to trolling motor mirror mode, and what that does is now my transducer will point the same direction my trolling motor is pointing. So wherever I turn my trolling motor foot pedal now, it will move the forward-facing sonar
transducers the same direction. So it's just like it was rigidly mounted onto my trolling motor shaft. So that's what that does. It also has a third mode, which is called compass mode. If I press the left button one more time, short, now you see two red LEDs with a green LED in the center. So that just set an azimuth, the direction that the green LED is pointing. So now however my boat turns, I'm turning my foot pedal up and down, but the azimuth stays the same. So you can aim at a boat dock or a brush pile, and no matter which way your trolling motor is turned to keep the right angle of the cast that you want to make, you still are locked in on that setting. Now let's say I have a brush pile over where I've got this flag icon. I'm going to show you another mode, which is what we call waypoint mode. And it's similar to using the autopilot to go to a waypoint, only I'm not going to engage the trolling motor. So if I press where the icon is, and then hit that, and then hit go to, just like you would if you were going to navigate there, but I don't turn the autopilot on. And you see now my azimuth is pointing directly towards that waypoint. And you'll see I've got two white LEDs centered with a green LED. So that's showing that my Revolution Sonar forward facing sonar is aiming directly towards that particular waypoint. And now I can orbit around it with my boat with the trolling motor. I can move my trolling motor, see me moving it away, and you'll see that the azimuth is continuing to point directly at that waypoint, which, like I say, if it's a brush pile, you can move your boat all around the brush pile and know exactly where to cast, because you're going to be casting the direction of that green LED. Now, another point to note is that the three LEDs, each LED represents 6 degrees. So there's 3 of them, so that gives you 18 degrees and tells you where to cast. And if you cast the direction of those 3 LEDs, you'll be casting right into that 18-degree fan. And 18 degrees is just a little bit wider than the transducer beam that's going out forward. So it really makes it easy to aim your cast exactly where you want them to go. It's a great setup. I'll show you, I'll pull it up now, my trolling motor up, and show you my transducers. As soon as you pull it up, it turns your transducers up where they're not going to be in the way, and then it parks them down in a safe position for running in rough water. So makes it very, very simple, very easy. And there we go. And when you pull the trolling motor up and put it back down, it puts it back into manual mode, and now I'm ready to aim again. So I hope that helps you. I hope you like that. This is Marc Marcantonio. Ciao. So that's what the Revolution Sonar does. I'm having too much fun with all of these fishing toys. So yeah, I'm missing the tournament circuit a little bit, but I'm not wasting that time. I'm still having fun learning new things. And I've got, on my YouTube channel, that video's on there. There are, this list over here lists all of the videos I've done in the last 2 years. It's a new channel. I've already got over 2,000 subscribers, and there's over 100 videos already that I've done. I'm doing them every week. So if you want to learn about bass fishing, I've got videos on there that cover everything from wiring your boat to fishing techniques. This list over here is on articles, magazine articles that I've written in the last couple of years. These have even more detail in them because it's a written article with photographs, and then there's a video involved in every one of these too. So if you click on these links, you know, dual forward-facing sonar, double your pleasure, double your fun. The Slinko versus the Senko. fisheries biology articles and things on eat, rest, and spawn, talking about the 3 functions of a bass that every fisherman that wants to catch more fish needs to understand the 3 things that a bass does in its life. It eats, it rests, and it spawns. And it gives you techniques to handle all 3 of those different phases. All kinds of information. So that's what has been keeping me busy. Now I want to briefly talk about some techniques.
Hey, Mark?
Yeah.
Do you mind if we take a break? We're going to come back to you.
Okay.
Lunch is ready.
Yep, let's do
We're
that.
going to open that door. We're going to take a break. We got lunch ready, and then we'll let Mark finish his seminar, okay?
All right. I'll share some of my experience with you about that. So, drop shotting is a technique that I picked up really early on. I was probably one of the first in Washington State to really do much with drop shotting. And that was back in I really started in 1996, but I really got good at it in 1998. And I had moved to Southern California in 1979 from the East Coast. I moved to Southern California, and I joined a club there called the San Fernando Valley Bassmasters, which was a huge club, and it had a lot of really good fishermen in it. One of the guys that really helped me was Don Ivino. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Don Ivino, the father of doodling. Yeah. Okay, so Don lived in Burbank, I lived in Glendale. We were almost neighbors, and I spent a lot of time with him and a lot of other really good fishermen in that club. And Don taught me the technique of doodling. How many of you know how to doodle? All right, some of you old timers, some of you guys have been around as long as I have. So doodling was basically using a Texas rig straight-tailed worm. At that time we used either Smitty worms or buddy worms. Bud Brashear, one of the guys in the club, made them for everybody down there, and a guy named Smitty did the first hand pours, really soft worms. And we would Texas rig them and usually use a 3/16 ounce conical sinker, Texas rig sinker, and let them sink to the bottom in deep water, usually deep water, and we would just vibrate the rod tip like this. And that was called doodling. And you would just wait until something felt a little different. You didn't often feel a sharp bite. It wasn't easy to tell when you were getting bit. It was a technique you had to develop a feel for. The guys who were really good could never explain to you why they set the hook. It's just something didn't feel the same. Maybe the weight felt a little bit heavier, or it felt like they were snagged into a wet dish rag. I like to explain it like that. The rod tip just didn't quite vibrate with the same rhythm. And you're doing this all with just your wrist. And generally you're using light line. At that time we used 8-pound tests for the most part, and it was monofilament because we didn't have fluorocarbon back then. Now we've got braid, and we can use fluorocarbon leaders, and a lot of changes have happened. But that doodling technique is actually what I started getting really good at and winning a lot of tournaments in Southern California on that. And then when I moved up to Washington, I basically started transferred that knowledge and expertise into the drop shotting technique, which I had read about because, as you know from my earlier talk, I study everything I can study about fishing. So I learned about it from Don. Was probably the biggest guy to bring the drop shot technique to the United States. Don was the first guy I know in the United States to actually drop shot, and I picked it up from him right away. Drop shotting is, for those of you who don't know, is a rig in which you've got the worm up above the weight. The weight hits the bottom, and your hook and bait are up above the bottom. So if the worm if the weight is sitting on the bottom, you've got this worm up above. I've got this one wacky rigged, and what's called wacky rigged, and then I often use that doodle technique with the drop shot, and I shake the rod tip, and that causes the worm to shake up and down. If you look at my YouTube channel, you'll see a video I posted a couple weeks ago of a robo worm, which is also one of my sponsors, And I've got the robo worm on a drop shot rig in the water. I think it was 40 feet of water of depth. And I've got my AquaView underwater camera in front of it. And I'm showing the action of the robo worm on the bottom in 40 feet of water. And you can watch that and you can see and get an idea of what's happening when you're shaking your rod tip. And that's one of the ways that I've learned how to vibrate a worm properly, by watching myself doing it in deep water. If you have a swimming pool, the swimming pool's great for that kind of stuff. But most of us don't, particularly up in the Pacific Northwest. And also you can't do that in deep water. So an underwater camera actually works really well. And it's another piece of electronic that puts more fun in my fishing, and I use them a lot. I see fish on my sonar and I drop the camera down and I can tell what type of fish they are then by looking at the camera. Very, very helpful in learning your fishing. Anyway, so drop shotting, you're putting the worm up above. This happens to be a 5-inch Yamamoto thin Senko. I've been with Yamamoto. They're been one of my sponsors for over 30 years now, and I'll never forget when I was fishing a Stratos World Championship in Kentucky Lake, and I was there, and I got a phone call while I was practicing for it, and I got this really excited phone call from a guy named Jerry Puckett, that went by the name of Bubba, and he says, "Mark, I got a lure. I'm sending you a box of them right now. You got to fish it during the tournament." And it was the Senko. It was the first Senko when they had just come out. So I probably got them before anyone in Washington State did, and I won a lot of money on a Senko for many years in this state because I was in on it from the ground floor. It's funny because that's one bait one thing I've learned over more than 5 decades of tournament fishing is that fish get smart to the lures we use and the techniques we use and even the electronics we use. And you can't keep doing the same thing over and over forever, or you're not going to be catching many fish. But anyway, drop shotting, and this being a thin Senko, this shape of a plastic bait, by the way, any type of long worm shape is a shape that bass don't learn to avoid. There are many lures that bass learn to avoid over the years from seeing them and people using them. But the one bait that has withstood the sense of, there's actually 2 shapes that have withstood the test of time, and that's a Senko style bait, a stick bait, and also a minnow shaped bait, like a jerk bait. Those are 2 baits that bass never get over conditioned to. And if you're struggling and you're trying all these other different lures like football head jigs and all these different lures, frogs, whatever, if you're not catching fish, it might be because the fish have gotten conditioned to them and where you're fishing. They never seem to avoid these. They just never do. And I guess they would find it hard to survive in nature if they avoided a minnow shape because that's the bulk of their diet, or a crawfish shape because it's important to a bass diet, but also a worm shape is also just one that they don't seem to get overly accustomed to. So for drop shotting, I use, my preference is to use a Gamakatsu drop shot hook, and for the most part, 9 times out of 10, I am nose hooking the bait, where I'm just taking, this is a number 4 drop shot hook. Now, most people out there are using larger than number 4s. Most of them are using number 1s at the smallest, or a number 2 at the smallest, or a number 1. But I can tell you from experience that there are a lot of advantages that this number 4 gives you that you don't get with a larger drop shot hook. And I'll tell you, I was fishing a tournament once in the Willamette River. We actually launched out of Kalama, Port of Kalama, and I ran all the way up to Oregon City. And that's another reason why I don't mind fishing less tournaments nowadays, because what was that, like a 65-mile run one way through the main Columbia with all the barge traffic and ships and fighting their wakes, and then up the Willamette and fighting all the boats in the Willamette to get up to Oregon City. But I won that tournament, so it made it worthwhile. I spent an hour and a half to get up there, an hour and a half to get back, actually a little more than that to get back because the water being rougher. Did you fish that tournament, Chris? That was an ABA tournament, I think it was in August.
Yep.
And
Long runs.
long runs. Anyway, I had actually practiced up there in Oregon City the weekend before, and I found a group of big smallmouth in 11 feet of water in the center of the channel, right outside the Oregon City boat ramp area, marina there. And and I run all the way up there, and we start fishing. I was fishing with Bob Sweeney at that time before he passed away, and I hook a big smallmouth, and I'm fighting this smallmouth to the boat. And it comes up towards the surface, and it's about from me to the doorway, that door, and it comes up on the surface, and it's swimming parallel to the boat. And I've got my drop shot rig, and I'm all of a sudden the smallmouth just opens its mouth, and my lure comes back to me. It came unhooked. It didn't jump. It didn't do anything. It just opened its mouth, and my hook came back to me. And I don't lose fish very often, very few. That really upset me. What did I do wrong? I couldn't figure out what I did wrong. Another cast, I get another one. The very next cast, exact same thing happened. Big smallmouth came up, opened its mouth, and my hook came back to me. Then I started thinking, well, what am I doing different than I've ever done? And I realized the only thing that was different was I had snagged on a rock before, and I grabbed the first drop shot hook I had available, and I grabbed a Gamakatsu drop shot hook, the same exact hook, only in a size number 2, not a size number 4. It was a little bigger. And so I switched back to the number 4, just for no other reason but for my own sanity, because I didn't want this to happen again. I cast out there and I get another 4-pounder, and then I get another and another, and I ended up getting 20 pounds something in that tournament, and ended up winning the tournament. And the only difference was that number 4 hook. And I realized the second one that I landed, what the difference was. The fish were laying in the current, because it was August, they were just laying in the main current, and they were just sitting there. And you cast your drop shot rig up current, and it would bounce down like you're fishing for steelhead. Bounce it down the current, and the fish were just sitting stationary. They weren't really anxious to eat. And as the bait was bouncing towards them, they would just open their mouth and clamp down on it with their bone crushers, with their teeth patches. And smallmouth bass have a bony patch in the tip of their mouth, and on the bottom, and back in the roof of their mouth. And that tooth patch is how they grab bait and crawdads and things like that and hold on to it, and then they'll flare their gills and ingest it and suck it into their mouth. Well, these fish weren't really interested in eating. They were just trying to get this offending worm out of its way. So they were just sitting still and biting on it, and they weren't swallowing it. So it was in their tooth patch. Well, the second one that I caught with the number 4 hook, it was embedded in that tooth patch, and I broke the hook with my pliers trying to get it out of that tooth patch. And then I realized what the difference was. A number 4 hook is a thinner diameter wire, and it happens to be thin enough to fit through the tooth socket of the tooth patch of a smallmouth bass. Now, when they're feeding actively, you don't have to worry about that, because they'll kill it or crush down on it, and then they'll swallow it, and you can hook them with a larger hook, no problem. But if they're not really interested in feeding, and this happens a lot in the winter time when you're fishing vertically in 40 or 50 feet of water, the fish don't actively swallow bait like they do in the summer when their metabolism is high and they need a lot of calories to keep their weight growing. So by using that smaller hook, when you set the hook, it'll slip through the tooth patch of a smallmouth bass and stay hooked in them. And you don't lose those fish. They stay hooked. And believe me, it's not just smallmouth bass, it's largemouth bass too. The biggest bass I ever caught in the tournament was on Clear Lake, and it was 9.5 pounds during a Stratos World Championship qualifier. And I caught it on a number 4 Gamakatsu drop shot rig, a 9.5 pound largemouth. So on a drop shot rig. So this is one of the things I learned from trout fishing. Everybody thinks that we've always been taught in bass fishing, use the largest hook you can get away with. Well, I subscribe to that theory, but I've learned that the largest hook that you can get away with means a number 4 for smallmouth bass oftentimes, because anything bigger, if they're not taking the bait fully, you're not going to get that hook to sink in and be able to land that fish. So if you're losing smallmouth bass and you're not using a number 4 hook, I would suggest going down to a number 4. Now, Gamakatsu, at my urging for many years, finally came out with a G Finesse series drop shot hook. Gamakatsu is one of my sponsors also, so I've been with them for 30 plus years also. So they came out with their G Finesse series drop shot hook, and they finally came out with the number 4. Ron Hobbs Jr. and I petitioned them for probably a dozen years before they made it in a number 2, and they make it in a number 1 and a 1/0, but they didn't make it in a number 4. So I finally got them to come out with the number 4. And it's a great hook, and it's also a thin wire diameter. Now, if you're worried about the standard number 4 being too small, the new number 4 G Finesse series is actually a half size larger, even though it says it's a number 4. It's really closer to what I would call a number 3. So it is a little bigger. So you can use it with a little thicker bait. And that's often what I'm using now when I'm using a little thicker bait and I'm wacky rigging it. Here I have it nose hook, but when I wacky rig it through the center, I often will use the number 4 G Finesse series hook. And I use those during tournaments a lot. I don't use them in practice all the time because they're pretty pricey. Even at a pro staff level where I get them for free, I still try to conserve them. Understanding your hook is important. Now, the hook's not the only deal. In this case, I'm using braid. I don't always use all braid. I use braid on one of my drop. Chris.
Real quick question. I know you're talking about size 4 hooks, Mark. And probably a lot of guys. The thing that I think does this bait size dictates the hook size, correct?
Yeah, the bait, definitely. And you can't get away with using a number 4 on a really thick bait. However, if you nose hook it properly, even most thick baits, you can use a number 4, like this one. I have it nose hooked, and I know you can't see from the back, but let me explain something about how I hook the worm when I nose hook it. I learned a long time ago when I nose hook a bait, most people make the mistake of burying the hook too far down in the plastic worm. I nose hook it, I call it nose hook. I nose hook it so that the top of the bait is below the barb of the hook, below the barb. And the reason why I do that is because if a bass swallows this bait and balls it up in its mouth, you don't want the hook point to sink back into the worm when you set the hook. So I try to keep the barb and point as exposed as I can. And you say, well, but the bait will never stay on. It does. It'll last quite a few casts with a nose hook. Now, if you catch a bass or two and it falls off, okay, I'm willing to sacrifice my worm for a bass or two, okay? So that's a decision I made. But by nose hooking it like that, even a thicker bait, you can often nose hook it and still be able to use it. But then, again, if the bass are eating or if they're feeding actively, there's no need to worry about the smaller hook. If they're going to swallow it and take it in deep, then you can get by with a larger hook to match your bait size. But the other reason you want to stay as small as you can on the hook is because a smaller hook is lighter in weight. And by being lighter in weight, when you vibrate your rod tip, the weight isn't dragging the weight down, and the hook weight is not dragging the bait down and dampening the action that you're trying to impart on the worm. So you try to balance everything. You balance it. And most of the time, like this is a 6-pound test leader. I usually fish 6-pound test leaders or less. There are sometimes I use 5-pound and sometimes I use 4-pound. And when you're fishing these oligotrophic lakes like we have in Washington State, which means they're very low in nutrients, which means their water is very clear, smallmouth bass have excellent eyesight. they can see your fishing line. And if they're not focused on just the bait, if they're not really hungry, if they're not striking at the first thing they see to beat the other smallmouth that are in the school, if there isn't a predatory response of trying to be the first fish to the bait, then most of the time they're watching your bait while you're working it and deciding whether they want to eat it or not. And when they're studying your bait, if they see your fishing line, that's a clue to them that maybe something isn't quite right, and maybe I don't want to. Now, I've caught smallmouth bass on heavy line, and you can catch on reaction baits with heavy line all day long, no question about it, because the fish aren't focused on your bait and your line at a stationary position. But if you're fishing like a drop shot rig, and if there's no ripple on the water, if it's glass clear, calm, that's when you really need to lighten up on your equipment. So now, of course, I got to talk about the weight a little bit. When I started drop shotting and doing really good in the tournaments in 1998 on it, the one thing that bugged me the most was I couldn't find a weight that I liked. The only things that were available at that time were the Bakudan round weights, which worked really well, and they had a neat little clip on them, line clip on them. But the problem with round weights is that, for one thing, they roll on the bottom. And if you're fishing current, especially like the Columbia River, and you've got gravel beds or shell beds or rock beds, they get wet, they roll into the crevices and get snagged, and then you're fighting the rocks all the time. So there were some cylindrical weights out at that time, and they're really good for not snagging, but they're terrible as far as they have two qualities that I hate. And this is taking fishing to a level that most people just don't think about, but it's really made a difference in my fishing. One of the things that I teach is that if you want to feel bites, particularly in deep water, then one of the most important things you can do is to always make sure that your fishing line is as straight as it can be between your rod tip and the weight, okay? If you're fishing 40 feet of water and your line is going like this as it's sinking, which a cylindrical weight will do. It'll drag your line this way, then it'll change courses and go this way, and then it'll go this way. And when it hits the bottom, you've got all these S-bends in your line that is basically slack. Even though it feels like your line is fairly tight, it's not. It's got those bends in it. If a bass hits your worm right at that moment that it hits the bottom, which a lot of times bass will, you're not going to feel that bite. And the bass will spit your worm out, and you never even knew you got bit. I fish a lot alone, and one of the reasons I fish alone in the wintertime especially is because I take people out fishing and I'll catch fish, and they say they never got bit, and they get frustrated and they get upset. And it's not something you wake up knowing how to do right away. You have to develop a sense of feel. And you've got to make sure if you're fishing straight down in 40 or 50 feet of water, that your line is sinking as straight as it can sink, so that when your weight hits the bottom, you've got a perfectly straight line between your rod tip. And I learned this doodling, by the way. We would, if there was a breeze blowing at all, we would hold our rod tip down to the water's edge, and then open the bail or hit the free spool button, and let the weight drop straight down until we got slack in the line, and then immediately tighten up on it. And a lot of times you'd feel your rod tip get a little bit heavy, and you set the hook right away. So drop shotting is the same thing. It's so easy for a bass to hit your worm, your drop shot worm, and you never know that it did. So keeping your line straight is important. Now, problem is, if the weights don't round weights let your line sink straight. They do a perfect job. I didn't make them to sell. I didn't want to go into business. I do just about every type of fishing business there is, except guiding. It's the only thing I don't do. I do instructions, I do video, writing, lure manufacturing. I've manufactured a lot of lures that are in your tackle box right now are my designs. You just don't know it. The thing is, I couldn't find the weight that I wanted. So I made my own. I wanted a teardrop shaped weight, because a teardrop shaped weight is as perfectly hydrodynamic and aerodynamic as a round weight is. But it doesn't have the problem of getting snagged in rocks. and it sinks perfectly straight. And when you cast it, it casts perfectly straight like a bullet. And it pulls your drop shot worm behind it, and it's so much easier to deal with. And so when it sinks, you've got your line straight between your rod tip and the weight right away. So, quick drop. I only started selling them because everybody kept bugging me to make them for them, and I was running out of my own weights. I couldn't keep up with it, so and they're made in the United States.
What's the difference between the bass casting sinker and yours?
So I actually realized that a bass casting sinker is similar in shape, and so they were also called Dipsy sinkers, and we used them back in the 50s and 60s for crappie rigs and things like that. And that's why I knew that shape was a good shape. But this has a line clip in it. It's got a couple of important differences. This has the same type of line clip that the original Bacadans did, only it's a better version. This line clip will hold 2-pound test line as tight as can be. It'll hold 40-pound test line. It doesn't matter what size. The other thing is that this weight, the full swivel of the line clip is outside of the weight. It's not embedded in the lead. Any of the other teardrop weights, and all the tungsten teardrop weights, by the way, because tungsten is so hard, they can't pour tungsten. Believe me, I tried. I tried to come out with a tungsten version because everybody said, oh, well, you got to have tungsten now. I went down that path, I tried, and I gave up on it for a couple reasons. For one thing, tungsten is extremely expensive. For another, you have to have it made overseas. You can't make it in the United States. And for another reason, the swivel isn't completely outside of the tungsten weight. Half of the swivel is glued into the weight. So you only have one swivel point, whereas on my quick drops, you have 2 swivel points. Those 2 swivel points really reduce the line twist. And more importantly, it also lets the weight slink like a slinky over top of obstructions. It bends, and it's a streamlined clip and a small swivel, and the point of the lead is so small that there's nothing to hang up. There's no edge to hang up as it's crawling over rocks. And that's the reason, all these years I figured some big company was going to put me out of business. They'd make them and compete with me, and I'd have to give up because I wouldn't be able to compete with a large company. But nobody's been able to do it because they don't seem to be able to make the lead small enough at the tip to hold the clip on firmly like I do and get both swivel points. So it hasn't been knocked off yet. So, and I don't really care if it does or doesn't. This is just little extra fishing money so I can buy some electronic toys and stuff. I don't do it for a living. Okay, so quick drops. Now, I make them in 8 different sizes. And believe me, this isn't meant to be a commercial. I'm trying to teach something about these here. I make 8 different sizes. Each one's color-coded. So I'm going to ask you a question. Of these 8 different sizes, there's a 1/16 ounce, a 1/8 ounce, a 3/16 ounce, a 1/4 ounce, 3/8 ounce, ½ ounce, 3/4 ounce, and 1 ounce. Of those 8 different sizes, what size do you think I've won the most money on?
3/8.
I heard the right answer over here. 3/8 ounce. 3/8 ounce, I've won the most money on. What's the second most money, and almost as much as I have on the 3/8 ounce? Yep. Haven't heard it yet. 1/16 ounce. 1/16 ounce. How many of you have ever fished the 1/16 ounce? Good for you guys. So many people are missing the boat. I sell 3/16 ounce. When I first started making them, 3/16 ounce was all I could sell, especially in California. Everybody wanted 3/16 ounce. Then it switched to 1/4 ounce. Now I sell more 1/4 ounce than any other size. It's a great weight. I've done really well with it, both of those. But I've won more tournaments on a 1/16 ounce and on a 3/8 ounce, more boats on a 3/8 ounce than any other size. And the reason, there's a couple reasons for that. And when you think of drop shotting, everybody thinks it's a situation of you make a weight as heavy as you can get away with, it drops to the bottom, it sits on the bottom and anchors your line, and then you vibrate your worm. Well, that is drop shotting. By definition, that's drop shotting. But there are ways of fishing it that most people just don't think about. And that's this technique that I developed along with Ron Hobbs Jr. I have to give Ron Hobbs Jr. a lot of credit for this also. We were partners together. We developed this in some way by accident. And in fact, when I first discovered this, I was fishing a tournament again on the Willamette River, and it was an ABA tournament, and I was fishing, geez, what's the name of that island? Can't even remember it right now. It's been so long since I fished there. It was during the spawn, and I was fishing and doing really well. I was catching fish on crankbaits right and left. I love, by the way, drop shotting is not my favorite way to fish. I love the crankbait, I love the jerkbait. Those are my bread and butter. Those are what I think I can hang with anyone on. But I win more money on drop shotting. I catch more fish on drop shotting. I can't not drop shot if you want to be competitive. So you got to learn to do it. But it's just not the most fun thing. But anyway, I was catching fish on crankbaits right and left. I had a limit in a few minutes, and I had a pretty good weight in my boat. And then one of my competitor friends, which a lot of you know him, came around the corner in his boat, in his Stratos, and I was fishing with Bob Sweeney at that time, and I didn't want him to see that I was catching all these fish on the crankbait. So I put my crankbait rod down, and I grabbed a drop shot rod that I had rigged up with me. And I took the weight I had on the drop shot off because I had a 1/4 ounce weight on there, and I put a 1/16 ounce drop shot weight on there, and I cast it out there, and I started just reeling it back and casting it and reeling it back. And my thought process was, Gino Stalter was the angler. Gino would see me throwing a drop shot rig, and I knew Gino didn't know how to fish a drop shot rig. He was a power fisherman. He couldn't stand even having a spinning rod in his hands at that time. So the problem was I started catching more fish, and I started catching bigger ones in front of him. And I ended up replacing every fish in my live well with new fish that I caught, swimming a drop shot rig through a spawning area. And then Ron and I started fishing together in tournaments, and Ron took what I had started and developed it to a science. I mean, he was the one guy that was as detail-oriented as I was on everything. And we started winning tournaments right and left with both of us drop swimming in Lake Washington, Sammamish, all the tournament lakes. And that's because we weren't fishing it like everyone else. Everyone else was casting it out, let it sink to the bottom and shaking the rod down. Go ahead.
Were you still using a stick style bait when you were drop swimming, or what kind
At
of
that
boat?
time I wasn't, because these hadn't been invented at that time. So at that time we started out using a worm called a tapeworm. It was made by a friend in Idaho, and he doesn't make them anymore. But I still have probably 1,000 in a couple different colors. I still catch fish on them.
You want some?
Well, I'm working with Yamamoto Baits right now to come out with a new worm that is similar to the tapeworm. It's actually another worm that I've caught a lot of fish on, where I took this Senko, or a 3-inch 9B Senko, or a 3-inch 9C Senko, and I'd cut it in half with a surgical knife. And then I'd take the Yamamoto flat tail worm, which they no longer make because it never sold well, and I weld it to the top half of the half of a Senko. So I have a round worm at the top and a flat tail at the bottom. That flat tail catches a lot of water when you're shaking the bait, and the round part holds a hook much better. The problem with the Yamamoto flat tail worm was it wouldn't stay on your hook very well. So Yamamoto is deciding whether they're going to come out with it or not. Hopefully they do. If not, I have to keep making my own. But anyway, we would cast this out, And we would use a 16th ounce weight or a 1/8 ounce weight. If there was any breeze at all, we'd have to go up to a 1/8 ounce weight. And we'd cast it out, and we would use the rod tip, and we would basically bounce the rod tip up and down while we're constantly turning the handle of the reel. We're reeling almost the whole time. And by shaking the rod tip, we're shaking the rod tip just enough so that the weight is moving slowly on the bottom. And the reeling at a steady pace was just to make sure that you always had the same amount of tension on your line, on your rod tip throughout the whole process. And so we would drop swim along the bottom. If we were in 10 feet of water, we might have to go up to a 3/16 ounce weight. If we were in 15 feet of water, we would go to a 1/4 ounce weight. With the quick change release, with the quick change clips on here, it's real simple just to take one off, reach into your pocket and pull a bigger one out and attach a bigger one. So we would be drop swimming along the bottom. As the years went on, Ron and I both learned that there were a lot of fish that we were missing because smallmouth don't always feed just on the bottom. When they're feeding on sculpin, which is a very prevalent bait fish in Washington State, and if you look at one of my most recent videos last week, I posted a video showing a sculpin that I caught, and I talk about the value of them as a lure you want to a bait you want to imitate with a lure because it's a very important food fish for smallmouth bass. And by the way, for Yamamoto bait, some guys like Chris know this, a Yamamoto number 176. If you've known me over the years, you've seen me write many times about Yamamoto color number 176. And I think they call it cinnamon with black flake. But that color, the reason it works so good is because it's the perfect match for a sculpin that's native to Washington State, that stays on the bottom, is an important food fish for smallmouth bass. So that's why that's so important and so good. But we learned that all of these bass aren't always on the bottom. Sometimes in Washington, Lake Washington, for instance, you have some bait fish that, not just yellow perch, but also longfin smelt and 3-spine stickleback. So one of the important things, which you'll see in some of the articles I've written over the years, if you want to be a better fisherman, don't study the owl, study the mouse. Don't study the predator, study the prey that the predator eats. If you study what they eat, then you've solved the problem much better than most people. Because like I say, the fish either eat or they rest or they spawn. If they're not spawning, they're either resting or eating. So you need to make your bait look like something they want to eat or something that's going to antagonize them into biting when they're resting by putting a bait right in front of their face. And that's one of the things that a drop shot bait does real well. It's a finesse technique, yes, but it can invoke a reaction strike because just like my story on the Willamette River, when I won that tournament, drifting it by their face, when it comes into their face, they're the baddest predator out there. They're not going to shy away from something coming at them. They're mean. They'll attack it. They'll bite it. So if you can put it in their face, you can get them to bite. And a drop shot rig, surprisingly, does it as well as a jerk bait does. So anyway, this is how I nose hook them, real right to the very tip of the worm. And then when I wacky rig it, I usually try to do it at the midpoint, and I hook it so that it hangs on both sides, but don't restrict yourself to this. One of the guys that I fish with, who now lives up here, who used to fish in California a lot, who's really good, and some of you know him, Mike Goodwin, he always fishes it with this wacky style only 1/3 of the way into the worm, 1/3 down from the nose of the worm, and he does really well with that. So experiment, but there are different ways to do it so you can change your approach up so that if fish do start ignoring your nose hook bait, then wacky rig it. Now I will tell you, this bait, this is a thin Senko, not a slim Senko. There's a slim Senko and a thin Senko. Both are great, and I use both of them. And in fact, I show a video that I caught last week of a 6+ pound smallmouth in American Lake that I actually caught on the Slim Senko, the 9J Slim Senko, wacky rigged. But I normally catch them on this one more, the thin Senko, and I usually wacky rig it. And for some reason, the big smallmouth bass really like this rig, really like it. Now, leader length, you read articles, and this is one of the things I learned over the years too. People just aren't really good at describing how long their leader length is. And I've seen people tell me, oh yeah, I use a 12-inch leader length. And then I look at their rod and it's this long. And I'm sorry, but that's a lot longer than 12 inches. I don't know what they're measuring against, but they're not very good at describing it. So I show you, and trust me, there's no right or wrong answer. Right now, on lakes like American Lake, I'm fishing, there's a lot of moss on the bottom and weed growth on the bottom, even out in 25, 35 feet. And I fish a longer leader length for two reasons. For one, I'm getting my bait up above the bottom where they can see it. I've used my underwater camera enough to know that most of the bass that I'm fishing for are swimming 2 feet off the bottom. Even when they're resting 2 feet off the bottom. A lot of other places, they're right tight to the bottom feeding on crawdads. So it's dependent upon the place you're fishing. You have to mix it up. When they're up off the bottom, or I've got weed growth on the bottom and I want my worm out of it so the fish can see it, I use this long of a leader length. Many, many other times, I've got half that amount of leader. And then if I'm fishing somewhere where there's a silty bottom, my leader length may be shorter than the length of the worm overall. It may be just so that the worm is hanging just above the weight. And here's a reason why that works. If you ever saw a bass feeding on a macroorganism along the bottom of the lake and it's silty, like a crawfish, when it's trying to burrow into the mud to get away from a bass, a predator, little puffs of the mud are coming up. So when it's that time of the year, late summer, particularly early October, there's a lot of crawfish. The bass, particularly in Lake Washington, will move on the mud flats and chase crawfish. And I've learned this because I use my underwater camera and I'd see these trails in the mud. And I'm wondering, what the heck are these trails in the mud in 30 feet of water on a mud flat? And I keep following them with my camera, and all of a sudden I see a great big crawfish is crawling, and the crawfish is what's making that trail. So I shorten my leader up. I use a plastic worm, usually a larger plastic worm. And what I'm trying to do then is I'm bouncing it up and down on the bottom so that my weight is simulating a crawfish that's trying to burrow away. I imagine in my mind there's a smallmouth bass down there looking at my worm. I'm shaking it up and down, pounding my weight against the bottom, and little puffs of silt are coming up, just like a crawfish makes when it's trying to burrow into the mud. And at that time, a lot of times I'll use a 1/2 ounce quick drop because it does a better job of shaking the mud up. So, and another thing that I learned in the winter time, the fall of Lake Washington, by using a 1/2 ounce and dropping it down, the speed in which your worm drops, your bait drops, can invoke a reaction strike from smallmouth bass that are down there just hanging out there and are lethargic. So you got to think drop shotting is not just drop shotting. There's expanded. When we would cast out the backside of the boat and catch fish in the middle of the lake when everybody else was fishing the shoreline. And we'd do well and they'd be wondering what the heck's going on? How could they be doing that? Now we've got forward facing sonar. Man, it makes it easy. It takes drop swimming, what I've been doing for 30 years now, and it's made it a whole new animal because I can cast my drop shot rig out. I can use, if there's no wind at all, I'll use a 1/16 ounce often over 30 feet of water. I'll cast it out, and when I do that, I'm using a rod where I have straight fluorocarbon. I use straight fluorocarbon, 6-pound test. It casts really well. You can cast, this is a 1/16 ounce quick drop. And that's usually how long of a leader that I use. My weight, still here. My weight is only this far below my bait, and I use a minnow style bait. This happens to be a Bass Tricks shad fry that I designed a long time ago, specifically for Lake Washington. This is a stickleback color pattern. I modeled this after the stickleback in the lake, and it works dynamite. And there probably isn't a one of you that has one of these in your tackle. I don't even know, to tell you the truth, that Bass Tricks still makes them. The owner sold, and they still make it. Well, I'm the guy that developed this color, green on the back modeled, silver on the sides, and a red chin, like a stickleback has. And in the months of May and June and July, this is a killer bait. And we would cast it out into deep water with a 1/16 ounce weight, let it sink for about 5 seconds, 10 seconds. We would usually count down to get it at different depths, and then start drop swimming it back to the boat, reeling real slowly and shaking it. Because the weight is below the bait, even when the weight is not on the bottom, it still shakes the bait more than a Texas rig does, or more than a Domiki rig does, more than a jig and minnow. So you can get better action out of the bait, even in the middle of the water column, by using light line, light equipment, and shaking it at the right depth. And you can control what depth you're fishing. And if the wind starts blowing, you have to go up in weight size. You can go up to a 3/16 or a 1/4 ounce. I can watch this on my Forward Facing Sonar. I have a video that I have on my YouTube channel that shows you how I'm testing my Forward Facing Sonar. I mentioned this to someone here earlier. If you want to learn how to use your Forward Facing Sonar, one of the best tips I can give you is find a long dock out on the water, preferably with the outside dock of a marina. If you go to like Lake Washington and you go to the one of the marinas near the I-90 bridge in the East Channel, you'll find there's 3 marinas over there, and each of them has a real long dock that's out in deep water. I position my boat right next to the dock. You could tie your boat to a cleat on the dock. I just use anchor on my Ghost trolling motor. And then I aim my Forward Facing Sonar parallel with the dock. I have my bow pointing towards the shore, and I'm a long ways away, and I just start making underhand pitches with my drop shot rig, or you can use a jig, or you can use a jerk bait, anything you want. I start 20 feet out until I'm really good at getting a good signal on my Forward Facing Sonar, watching my lure come back to the boat. Then I try to stretch it a little further. I'll cast 30 feet, watch it, 40 feet, watch it, 50 feet, 60, 70, 80. I can see my rig 100 feet out from my boat because I've learned exactly how to aim it. And the best way to learn how it's being aimed and how it's working is, like I said, anchor yourself right next to a long dock and take a few minutes of your time, not worrying about catching fish, but just trying to learn to see your lure. That time you spend is so important. Now I can be out in the middle of the lake in the wind, and I can use my Forward Facing Sonar, and I can track my lure better than most people. I can see the fish, I can see my lure. You always want to keep your lure above the fish and make the fish come up to eat it. Don't fish it at their level or below their level. Sometimes you can get them to follow your bait all the way to the bottom and go eat it, but 9 times out of 10, when they're suspended like that, they want to feed up. And if you're in a bass's world in the water and you're looking down, it's hard to see a lure or a bait because it's a dark bottom. The eyes are looking down at a dark bottom. When a bass is in the middle of the water column and he's looking up, the surface of the water, even on a cloudy day, is silvery, and they can see anything between them and the surface a long distance away. So if you keep your bait above them, they can see it easily. And that's a very important clue on drop shotting, drop swimming, and even fishing Domiki rigs or anything else. But always try to keep your bait above the level the fish are. If I see them suspended in 20 feet of water over 40 feet bottom, I'm trying to fish 15 feet below the surface. And I use whatever size weight I need to reel in and fish at that level. Okay, so I could talk and ramble forever, and I apologize for that, but I wanted to give you guys time to ask questions about various different things. You already saw the video on the Revolution Sonar and how I'm using that. That's available now. People can order those, but they're being made in small quantities because the guy who built it and designed it is making every one of them personally. He makes all the parts himself. He machines them all. This is the foot pedal, and this is machined out of a solid bar of aircraft aluminum. The wheel is made out of 1/2-inch thick bulletproof plexiglass that he machines down to the size. The switches on them are $80 a piece switches that are used in fighter jets, so they don't fail. They won't wear out or fail. It's not cheap, but if you're a disciple like I am of knowing everything about fishing, it's absolutely a great pickup to get. You don't have to do that to enjoy it. I mean, I started out, as I was explaining, I started out in an 8-foot roto-molded plastic boat when I belonged to the Mill Pond Bassmasters in Delaware in the late 1969, 1970. One person little plastic boat. I didn't have much money. My father was a school teacher. But over the years, if you are fortunate like I have been and worked multiple careers, you can afford some of these toys and they make fishing fun. But you don't have to have them. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. Any type? Yes?
Would you say in Washington State there's a depth that delineates when we're kind of done with crawfish forage for the most part? Do they have a depth range that they typically don't go deeper than that you found?
So, a couple of ways to answer that. First of all, crawfish will go as deep as we can find bass. So there are crawfish in 65 feet of water. A lot of people don't know that.
No.
In fact, right now, when I travel down to Southern California and I'm fishing Lake Casitas for bass, I'm fishing jigs in 50 and 55 and 60 feet of water. And the bass that I'm catching, that other people aren't catching, have 4 and 5 and 6-inch bright red crawfish coming out of their throats. So a lot of people don't realize they will, if the bottom is right and the conditions are right, they will be in deep water. So to answer your question, I generally find that October time period is when I start losing the crawfish bite. I catch fish on crawfish lures, jigs, football head jigs, crawfish imitators, all through October. I can catch them in the winter, in November, December, January, February, all that time period. I can catch them on those jigs too, but I don't catch as many. The bite is just not as good, and I never seem to find a crawfish and a bass in the middle of the winter here. Most of the time, they're chasing yellow perch. In the case of American Lake, they're chasing juvenile kokanee. They're chasing smelt in Lake Washington. That's when the smelt bite really comes on in the middle of the winter. So it's all lake specific. They're sculpin all the time, so you can catch them on sculpin baits, and that's why the jigs and crawfish imitators work good all year round, is because they're really doing a good job of imitating the sculpins.
Gotcha.
Yeah, does that answer?
Absolutely, yeah, makes sense.
Okay, who else? Yeah, Michael.
What's the length of that drop shot rod?
So these rods are, this is kind of interesting too. This rod is not a drop shot rod. This rod's a saltwater rod, believe it or not. This is a Lama Glass Flat Series rod. It's actually designed to fish for redfish. But I have been a Lama Glass pro staffer for, 35 years or so, and I've got hundreds of rods. And because I fish for saltwater and freshwater and everything, a lot of times I'm using gear that's meant for something else. And this has just been the perfect drop shot rod for me, particularly for big fish. Okay, this rod is designed for bass fishing and for drop shotting. And this is a 3-power spinning rod. It's a Lamiglass also, titanium.
What's the length on it?
This is 6'8".
And the other one?
The other one's 7'2". But I'm going to tell you, I've won more boats on a 6.5-foot rod drop shotting than I have on either of these two. This is my big fish drop shot rod. I just have not found a better rod to fish a big fish with. Now, it's not because of the rod per se as much as it is the action on the rod lets me fight a big fish on light line. I buy rods and I use rods more on the technique and how I'm using it. My wife can't believe, I have over 100 rods, and my wife says, what do you do with all those? And I use them. I use a different rod for every technique, and it's just something you develop over the years, and it's not that you have to. It's just that I learned that if I'm fishing for big fish, I'm using this rod. If I'm fishing light drop swimming, I'm using this rod. But when I've won boats on the Columbia River and stuff, it's been on a 6.5-foot rod. And when you're fishing in the winter, I recommend using a shorter rod than a longer rod. I want a long rod when I want to cast a light rig a long distance and get it far away from the boat so the boat's not spooking the fish. And it's good for fighting the fish. But a 6.5-foot rod is better if I'm vertically fishing, and I'm fishing current vertically, because the rod tip being closer to your hands, when you're using a light rig and a drop shot rig and you're vibrating that rod tip, you can actually feel the tip better on a shorter rod than you can on a long one.
My favorite rod, I broke it on the Columbia, was a 6'6" Lamiglass.
Yeah.
With a graphite Tennessee handle, so I taped real to it.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it was, but it just, when it came to the drop shot, that rod seemed to work way better than anything else.
If you're starting out especially, I recommend using a 6.5-footer. Everyone uses longer rods now. But a 6.5-footer is a better way to learn, and you'll develop the feel better, and then you can start going up in size to get longer casting distance once you get the feel down. Okay, next question.
Mark, on what knot do you use, and then do you ever go to a bigger hook than the 4 in the summertime then?
Yeah, so yes, the knot that I use the standard Palomar knot, okay? But I don't tie it the way most people do. And that's another one of the little details that I think is important. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Palomar knot. When you double it up, stick it through the hook eye, and you do the overhand knot, and then you slip the loop over the hook, okay? Most people in every diagram that you see in any fishing magazine has you pulling the line tight, and then the loop cinches up at the base of the knot. I don't do it that way. I take the loop and I pull it all the way over to the top of the knot. And if you do that, the loops in the overhand knot stay loose and free. And then I gradually tighten it down, and so my loop is over the top of the knot, not the bottom of the knot. And then the second thing I do is I pull it as tight as I can physically pull it with my hands. Or I use a little, use something like a scissor handle to hold the hook, and I pull it as tight as I can. The biggest mistake people make with fluorocarbon is not tying your knot tight enough. If you have any looseness in the fluorocarbon at all, and you give a good hook set, that knot is slipping just enough to burn it and cause it to break. So people who have problems with the Palomar knot are not tightening it down tight enough. And so even with 5-pound test and 4-pound test, I use a Palomar knot, and then I pull the tag end back through the hook eye. And if you could see, I know you can't from there, but if you could see, this is a Palomar knot on here, and when I tighten it all the way, the knot ends up going inside the eye of the hook. So it's also protected, and it is a lot more protected. It's strong. If I've had many times when I'll either break the knot at the braid or break the leader, not the knot at the hook. So now I also retie often, especially if I catch a big fish. I retie probably more frequently than most people, and that's one reason I like the Palomar knot, is because it's so quick and easy to tie that it's not so burdensome that I get lazy and won't retie when I should. That's a big mistake people make, is they get lazy and they haven't had a bite for 15 or 20 minutes, so they don't bother to change their knot, and then they catch a 6-pounder and it breaks off and they wonder why. Now, another thing that I do that is important is how I set my drag and how I set the hook. I want the drag loose enough that I can easily pull the line off the reel by hand. And the way I've learned to do this over the years is I want my drag loose enough that when I reach the top of my hook set like this, you can hear it slip. So these hooks are so sharp and the wire so thin, again, because it's a number 4, it doesn't take a lot of force to drive the hook in. What I try to do is make that force a sustained force. I tried to generate power to the hook point, keep it sustained through a long hook set till I can get proper tension on the line so that I can fight the fish and not lose it. So one of the things I think that has won me a lot of tournaments that others lose is you go to, if you've been to any tournaments and you stand around at the weigh-in, you hear everybody say, oh man, I would have won today if I hadn't lost that fish or hadn't lost that one. You know what? I'd be embarrassed if I came to a weigh-in and told you I lost the tournament because I lost the fish. Now, there are some times you just can't help it. You know, particularly if it's a topwater lure with treble hooks or a crankbait and a largemouth bass somersaults out of the water, they're gonna throw the hook sometimes. But on a drop shot rig, you just don't lose many fish if you got everything set right. Reeling, when you get a bite, reeling and getting your line tight as you can. If you watch my videos, you'll know I'm getting ready to get a bite before I ever set the hook. If you watch me, because you'll see my posture changes. I start reeling real quick with my rod, my reel, and I reel until my rod tip loads up. Once my rod tip loads up, then I use my rod tip is low to the water. Then I use that long pull like this to have a long sustained hook set, but my drag is slipping so I don't put too much pressure and break the line. My drag is slipping much quicker than most people. But if you're using a 5-aught hook and it's a heavy, thick barb and it's a heavy wire hook with a punching rig or flipping rig, you gotta set the hook hard. But if you're fishing light stuff like this, you don't wanna set it hard. So that's a little tip on that.
The bigger hook he asked about too.
Oh, the bigger hook, yes. The only time I use a bigger hook
Make sure you
is
bring
particularly
your
in the
line back
summertime.
through the eye.
In the summertime, when a fish's metabolism is high, when the water temperatures get to 68 degrees and above,
I've never
smallmouth bass
lost
peak
fish on it.
metabolism is at 68 degrees. A largemouth bass's peak metabolism is at 72 degrees. When a largemouth bass is in 72-degree water, it can digest its bait fish in a matter of 6 hours. It can completely digest a bait fish. In the winter, it may take a week for one bait fish to get digested in the metabolism of a bass because of the colder water and their metabolism is colder. So when the fish are actively feeding in the summer, when the water temperature is 72 degrees, I don't have to worry so much about finessing them, and I'll use a bigger, and especially if I'm fishing for bigger fish, I'll use a number 2 or a number 4, a number 2 or a number 1 drop shot hook on a thicker bait. Just for that reason, and I'm often using 8-pound test at that point, so I can generate a little more hook force when I'm setting the hook. So,
Thanks,
okay.
Mark.
Anything
Thank
else?
you very much for that.
All right.
A round of applause for Marc